Help me, Spock. Help me, Spock. Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Savage Curtain, which is episode 22 of season 3 of Star Trek The Original Series. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode to win my latest user poll for the original series is the third season episode, The Savage Curtain. So The Savage Curtain is the episode where Abraham Lincoln appears floating in space to the Enterprise crew. He then comes aboard and insists that he is in fact the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, and they are orbiting this planet that is inhospitable to human life. However, a patch of habitable area suddenly appears in Abraham Lincoln and insists they beam down there, and they beam down there and find this alien who forces Kirk and Spock to participate in an epic fight between himself, Kirk, Spock, Abraham Lincoln, and Sorak, the notable historical Vulcan, the father of logic, and their fight against Genghis Khan, Kalis, and two other notorious figures from history. And they have a battle, and has the Enterprise crew watch, and Kirk and Spock are victorious, and they get to beam back to the Enterprise. It's so hard to say that synopsis with a straight face. Anyway, so here's the thing I want to make clear at the start of this review. I think writers, and particularly the writers of this episode, and maybe throughout other TV and film, they have this notion that if you do something that's ridiculous, outrageous, and just plain stupid, that it's okay as long as the characters in the fiction acknowledge that it's a bit ridiculous and nonsensical. Which is what I think they were trying to do with this episode, because Abraham Lincoln appears floating in space to the Enterprise, which, on the face of it, there's no getting around it. That is a stupid idea. That is nonsensical. That doesn't make any sense. It defies all logic. It is dumb. But it seems like they try to excuse this by, when Lincoln beams aboard, the characters all acknowledge how ridiculous this situation is. Where Scotty is like, "Oh, and Robert the Bruce is gonna beam aboard next," and they all think that they all give Kirk shit for the fact that he actually takes him seriously and treats him like Abraham Lincoln. And Kirk is just like, "Look, I don't know who this guy is, but for the moment, it benefits us to actually, go along with this." And I actually understand Kirk's reasoning here, but that's not my point. The point is, from a writing perspective, I believe this is the writers trying to say, no, it's okay that this is fucking ridiculous because all the characters are acknowledging it's ridiculous. But I'm here to tell you definitively that that is no excuse. That does not help. That does not soften the blow or make anything any less ridiculous or stupid or nonsensical just because you have the characters acknowledge that it's stupid and nonsensical. It's still stupid and nonsensical, and that alone completely destroys this episode, making it what I believe one of the worst episodes of the whole show. Now, it has some of these patriotic chest beating that they did in the Make It Glory as well, although not quite as bad. But the way they portray Abraham Lincoln, and in fact, why would they choose Abraham Lincoln? Why would aliens? Again, this is similar to my complaints of Spectre of the Gun. Why would random aliens who know nothing about humans dig deep into Kirk's mind and pull out a historical figure from 500 years now? 500 years ago? I mean, would Abraham Lincoln really be to the forefront of Kirk's mind? I mean, Kirk is from Iowa, but in this state, the Earth is a part of the Federation. You think he wouldn't be that bogged down in considering U.S. history, but let's say that he is, but it's still a 500-year-old figure that these aliens like dig into his mind and pull out and present to him. It's the whole concept of it is completely, not only is it ridiculous, but is also unbelievable. Like it is nonsensical. It is just utter and complete gobbledygook nonsense. It is what it is. It's worse than Spectre of the Gun. Especially how they have him floating in space. And the way Abraham Lincoln is portrayed in this episode is he's like the vestige of good, and that's kind of how he's presented, because this alien on the planet, the molten lava thing, it looks cool design for the alien. That's probably the only thing I like about this episode, especially for the original series, because their alien designs are known for being shit. I mean, it's obviously a guy like in a heavy blanket, but it's still, especially considering the 60s technology they had, I think it's one of the better looking aliens that they've done on this show, Atholians being the best. Yeah, so that's the only thing I like about this episode. But anyway, that alien being like, oh, the whole point is I need to find good versus evil. So that's the whole point. So he's assuming Kirk and Spock are good, and that Abraham Lincoln is good, and that Kahless is evil. So Abraham Lincoln acts like, oh, he's very gentlemanly and very like I don't know. They sort of whitewash history. Now Abraham Lincoln, I'm totally against. By the way, I just want to throw it out there: the revisionist history from the Southerners to try to paint him as some sort of villain, and that the South were in the Civil War for any other reason than slavery, because it was right there in their Declaration of Independence, slavery. So, fuck revisionist history. But he might not be a villain, but he wasn't a saint either. He wasn't the vestige of good and a hero. He was just a fucking man. He was the president who started a war that killed, I don't want to say millions of people, but it killed a lot of people. Hundreds of thousands might be more accurate. And a civil war, a war between his own country. Now, yes, I believe he was justified in doing so, but that doesn't make him completely the absence of moral good in the world. And you can say, well, he abolished slavery. Well, his reasons were more political than anything else, and the fact at first he wasn't actually going to, that was eventually led to it. But anyway, I don't want to get into the politics of everything. My whole point is he's a human being. He's not a saint. He's not the big vestige of good. He's not the moral center of the universe. He's just a dude. And the way they portray him in this episode is, yeah, I find akin to patriotic chest beating bullshit. Now, the counter argument to this, if you want to argue in the universe, which I don't know why would you want to take this episode seriously, because it's just a bunch of nonsense, it's gobbledygook, but the counter argument to that is that this isn't really Abraham Lincoln. This is the image that Lincoln has that would these aliens pull from Kirk's mind. So maybe in Kirk's mind, he is has this vision of Abraham Lincoln as being this great man, vestige of good. So that's why it would materialize. Which, again, if you want to take this gobbledygook seriously, that does make sense. But then you would have to assume that Kirk has this whitewashed version of history where he thinks Abraham Lincoln is a saint, which does make me think less of Kirk. I think Kirk would actually have a more, especially being that far in the future where United States is probably not, it's not really a big deal. This is about Earth because the universe is expanded, that he would look at history more with an objective eye and not be so bombarded by patriotic, you know, biases, I should say. So, but you could use that excuse that's why, and also, by the way, that same excuse could be used for Kahless. So not let me talk about Kahless, because this is the first mention and of course introduction to the Klingon character of Kahless. Now in this episode, he's portrayed as he's on the side of evil. And the alien that introduces him, saying that he's sort of like a vestige of evil or whatever, has done a lot of horrible things. But of course, we know Kahless now, as they're watching Next Generation Deep Space Nine in particular, as Klingon Jesus. So I think that was a mistake on the Next Generation writers that introduced Kahless as the savior of Klingon, as Klingon Jesus, essentially, because that doesn't match up with this Kahless. In fact, if you look at the history and lore of Klingon lore that has explored in Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, the character we see in this episode would actually be best represented by Molar, who was Kahless's adversary. Now, he was seen as like a tyrant who more embodies evil. So, if anything, this character should have been Molar and not Kahless. But of course, all this history and lore was not invented by the writers for another 20 years or so. But, so mainly it's not on the writers of this episode, it's the writers of TNG, who shouldn't have called their Klingon Jesus Kahless. They should have made up another name and then made the enemy of Kahless, the tyrant, they should have called him Kahless, because then that would have matched up better with this episode. But, again, you could use the same excuse that this isn't the real Kahless, that the Excalibur aliens or whatever pulled the thought of Kahless from Kirk's mind, and in Kirk's mind he hates Klingons, so he thinks of their Klingon savior, Klingon Jesus, as evil. So you could make that excuse, but again, you're taking this gobbledygook seriously, and secondly, it just would have made more sense. I mean, especially the way he's portrayed. Help me, Spock. Help. It's just, you cannot, it's just mind-bending and doesn't make any sense to call this character Kahless, because he's nothing like the Kahless that we know. And I would argue, if you make that argument, I would counter-argue that this portrays Kirk in a bad light, that he was so bombarded by propaganda that he believes like the savior of the Klingon Empire to be like this really evil, dastardly person who impersonates people in order to kill them. However, getting a bit on the positive side of the episode, we have also Kahless wasn't the only mythical or historical figure in Star Trek that would endure from this episode. We also get Sorak, the father of logic, who would be brought up many times in the future, and in fact make an appearance in Vision or Katra form in Enterprise. And this one, I actually say, is kind of a positive of the episode, because Sorak actually does make a lot of sense. Having the way that he's portrayed in this episode, where Spock apologizes. Sorry, he's like, I must apologize for showing emotion. He's like, and and how he's the father of logic, and how he's all about peace, and was trying, and he's the one that sort of brought about peace in the Vulcan history. Like, that kind of is really good world building. because they could have brought instead of bringing in another historical figure with Abraham Lincoln, like they could have brought George Washington or King Arthur or some shit. But instead, they now I know King Arthur is fictional, but whatever. But you know what I mean. And but instead they made up a history for Vulcan, which is really good at world building and expanding the world. And Sorak would go on to be mentioned throughout Trek, and unlike Kalis, he's actually very consistent. The portrayal they have of him as the father of logic. So, yeah, okay, that's a positive of the episode. And also, speaking of positives that have to do with world building, you have, again, on the evil side, you have Genghis Khan, which I'll touch on a bit, but the other three characters are all made up. There was Kalis, which I already talked about, but then there were two more. I can't even remember something about an evil witch from another planet, which they didn't really get into her, so I'm not going to get into her. But I guess it's interesting that they brought up someone from a historical figure from a different planet. And then there's Colonel Greene, who was a notorious human, but from the future of when the episode aired, but from the past of the perspective of the in-universe timeline. And again, I like that. That's world building. That's stretching out. Instead of relying too much on real-life historical figures, you invent your own, because this story is, in fact, taking place in the 23rd century. And then Colonel Greene, also, he wasn't mentioned as much as someone like Sorak or Kalis, but he was mentioned again in Enterprise in the episode Demons and Terra Prime, where there was this xenophobic racist who was racist against all aliens who would quote Colonel Greene as his hero. And I do like that. And of course, that's more of a praise of Enterprise that they're making reference to this episode. But Colonel Greene was shown as kind of a sociopath who was very intelligent and good at strategizing, and so that, and his character didn't make sense from this episode, so that was also good at world building. So I'll give this episode some credit. But then there's Genghis Khan. Now I'm not that familiar, if I'm going to be completely honest, with the history involving Genghis Khan. I know that he was a conqueror and quite brutal with his conquering, and had conquered most of Asia and Europe. It's conquered a lot. It did a lot of warring, a lot of murdering, and it was not like a nice guy. But I find it interesting that they chose him to be on the evil side and not a historical figure who is more, let's say, European or white. That they chose someone who would be more considered an other. Maybe I'm being unfair here, but why not have Alexander the Great? He also did a lot of conquering and warring and stuff, but I don't know. It seemed like it wouldn't be as okay to consider him evil, but it's okay to consider Mongolian evil. But anyway, again, maybe someone more familiar with the history might say I'm being historically inaccurate, but I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. Anyway, so I don't mean to give this episode too much credit for having Sorak and Colonel Greene and stuff, because the whole concept of having this alien create like these historical figures for Kirk and Spock to fight with and fight against, to have to demonstrate the which is better, good or evil, is nonsense. It is gobbledygook. Like, why? I don't like these aliens. The concept is these aliens have no concept of good or evil. Well, why don't they sit down and have this philosophical discussion or study the Enterprise's database and read literature and philosophy and learn more about philosophizing about what is the concept of good and what is the concept of evil? Because I'm very strongly believe that these are very fluent terms that are open to interpretation. I mean, there are extreme examples where you could argue that it's pretty objective that something is good or something is evil, like what Hitler did during World War II could not be described in any objective term as good and much closer to evil, yes. But these are very sort of abstract terms, and there's a lot of different examples and of what could be good and what could be evil. And so it would be, so if the aliens who had no concept of good and evil, they wanted to learn about it, then yes, they would study it. They would maybe even have some philosophical discussions, bring Kirk and Spock down for philosophical discussions, and maybe they could recreate these historical figures to participate in these philosophical discussions. But instead, they decide to have a fight to the death. Like, how does that demonstrate what's better? Like the difference between good and evil? It doesn't. And it's very arbitrary. Like who, because of the historical figures they chose. Maybe Kirk and Spock could defeat, these particular historical figures, but maybe they reinvented maybe smarter historical figures, they wouldn't be able to defeat them. And maybe if they had Kirk and Spock had better historical figures as their allies, they would be able to win more easy. Like, it makes no sense. It is gobbledygook. It is nonsense. It is just a flat out excuse for the writers to have Genghis Khan and Abraham Lincoln show up. That's it. That is it. It is, and also to have a cool fight scene. Like, it kind of evokes, it's very, like, almost ripping off, I must say, of the episode Arena, because in Arena, Kirk is first forced to fight someone while the Enterprise has to watch, and it's these more powerful aliens who's testing them. That's pretty much the exact same thing here. So they just ripped the plot off, but did it in a much more silly, ridiculous, nonsensical way. Not that Arena is like an example of one of the best episodes ever. I mean, it's decent. I thought it was okay, but yeah, so they took that concept and they just made it silly, and it doesn't make any fucking sense whatsoever. Now, I had read that the original concept for the idea for this episode was to make a commentary on the bloodthirsty aspect of television and how television is kind of like the modern day arenas, the gladiator fights. Of course, they already did that commentary in the episode Bread and Circuses, which had modern day gladiators literally fighting on television, but that episode was dumb too. Not as dumb as this one. But anyway, so that was the original concept, was sort of make commentary on the manipulative nature of television and how it's just fodder, it destroys people's lives. It doesn't care about what it does. It's just all about entertaining the masses. But apparently that was in the first draft, and eventually future drafts kind of wrote that out. And now the final product, it barely comes up, and there's only one line where the alien says, "Oh, my entire planet is watching," that would imply that, and that's not a big enough implication. Like, I did not get that from this episode at all until I read that was their intention. It does not come off at all. And to be fair, like as I said, they didn't. It kind of got lost. The writers will even admit that concept got lost in future drafts. So, but now, it just comes off as a poor man's Arena with historical figures and for silly, ridiculous nonsense, which is all this episode is. It is a big ball of nonsense. It's one of the most worst written episodes. Like, yes, I will give it a little bit of credit for world building with Sorak and Colonel Greene, but only a tinge, and how cool the alien looked. But really, that does not at all stop this episode from being a big pile of garbage. So my rating for the Savage Curtain out of 10 is a 1, the worst. And I do believe this is in fact one of the worst episodes of the original series. I had already done my top 10 worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. This episode did not make that list, but it was in consideration. It was on the short list. And in fact, if I did a top 20 worst episodes of the franchise, this episode would probably make it. So it is that is how bad I think this episode is. I think it is one of the worst. The writing's nonsense. It's just a bunch of gobbledygook. There's no reasoning. It's just some bullshit to hero worship Abraham Lincoln. That's all it is. Anyway, that is it for my review of The Savage Curtain. Be sure to check out my channel as I continue to review episodes of Star Trek, as well as covering other shows like Star Trek Strange New Worlds, The Expanse, Better Call Saul, Star Wars Rebels, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.